It's time for the panel discussion. And before we get started, a lot of things happening around us. We got the world's largest democracy heading into polls. We have Brexit coming up. We have escalating trade tensions between the two largest economies in the world. And we have the era of ultra cheap money coming to an end with the central banks shutting it off at most advanced economies. So what does this all mean for our economy? Oh, and by the way, I just read somewhere that every time the Japanese currency appreciates the way it has in the last few months, it triggers or it foreshadows a really nasty global recession. So to tease out the correlations, the causations, talk about the nuances, and explain the profound, we have experts here tonight, and Mr. Rakesh Singh will be moderating our panel. Rakesh has been with HDFC since 2011. He runs the private banking, investment banking, and capital markets, and I'm sure many other practices at HDFC. He has worked with global banks such as Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and he's on the board of an NGO, Sneha. Rakesh, can I request you to come up here, please?
Hello, friends. Good evening. Let me take this opportunity to invite Dr. Ahluwalia as the first member of the panel discussion. He needs no introduction. Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Welcome once again, Dr. Ahluwalia. He was very keen to take questions, so we were itching to invite him on the panel. So please, Dr. Ahluwalia. Next, let me invite my friend Navneet Munot. Navneet is the CIO of SBI Funds Management, has over 24 years of rich experience in financial markets, oversees investments of about $42 billion across asset classes, equity and debt. Prior to that, he was a colleague of mine at Morgan Stanley. He's worked earlier with Birla Mutual Fund. He's the chairman of the Indian Association of Investment Professionals, and a prolific writer as well. He's a nominee director on SBI pension funds and postgraduate in accountancy and business statistics and a qualified chartered accountant. Welcome, Navneet. Let me also invite my other panel member, Rahul Singh. He is the CIO of Equities of Tata Asset Management. Over 23 years of experience. Rahul joined Tata Asset Management recently. In his previous role, he was at Ampersand Capital Investment Advisors, where he was the managing partner. Rahul is a BTech in mechanical engineering and alumni of IIM Lucknow. Welcome, Rahul. Dr. Ahluwalia, good evening. Let me start with you. The government recently announced the PM Kisan scheme that provides a guaranteed income of about 6,000 rupees per year to small and marginal farmer. Involves an outlay of about 75,000 crores. It further announced a 3% interest subvention on timely payment of interest and 2% for farmers affected by natural calamity. If you factor all that in a per capita income of India, which is about $1,600 or about 1.1 to 1.2 lakh, is it adequate, is the first question. Seems very piddly. And second, in this ongoing season of farm loan waivers, my question to you, having you served as a member of the Planning Commission, is it better use of resources to actually, through the budget, keep on doing farm waivers and recapitalizing public sector banks, or use these resources for a much better use in CapEx and generating employment?
That's a lot of questions. No, look, on farm loan waivers, I mean, I think virtually all economists agree. You know, a farm loan waiver is a...
I'm not sure people are able to hear. Can people hear?
No? Nobody can hear what I'm saying?
I think the mic is not.
Maybe somebody can give me a mic then. Can you hear now?
Yeah, better.
Okay. No, look, farm loan waivers are a sort of a mechanism that makes sense when you've had a sudden adverse development. We've done it in the past, different governments have done it, state level, central. So I would only assume that it cannot be a generalized response to all problems. I mean, there's a lot of people, for example, who believe that farm loan waivers a lot of people tend to believe that maybe farm loan waivers will make farmers debt-free. But the fact is, if you want the farmers to benefit from loans, then you don't actually want them at any given time. There'll be an outstanding amount of debt. The question is the debt sustainable or not? So obviously, if a farmer is adversely affected by weather and so on, there are other instruments that should be used, which is insurance and so on. The problem with farm loan waivers is that, it's only the rich farmers who get institutional credit. The vast majority of farmers do not get access to institutional credit. They are actually getting credit from the money lender, and no farm loan waiver helps them. So, that's been well known, but nevertheless, in our polity, these things kind of happen. On the issue of whether any particular income level is sufficient or not, in my view, you should never look at schemes without looking at the totality. At what cost is this coming? Is it coming at the cost of a fiscal deficit increase, or are you going to cut some other expenditure? Now, all the people who have recommended universal basic income of various kinds, what they've said is that we have a lot of subsidies which are dysfunctional and inefficient. Why don't we get rid of them and give a direct transfer? That makes a certain amount of sense. But when people discuss these individual things, I'm not aware that the intention is to cut anything else. So if nothing is being cut, then you're just increasing the fiscal deficit. But I don't think people are saying that. That's why what I said was that in order to look at a program, we should first be very clear. What is the promise regarding the fiscal deficit? If you are satisfied that that promise is sensible, then the rest is just a matter of, I'm going to spend the money on this rather than that. In which case, you need to know what is the rather than. I would certainly say that a direct benefit, if it substitutes for things like the fertilizer subsidy, the power subsidy, the interest subsidy, would be a good thing. But you are just asking that what they've done on interest subsidy, is that enough? So I think there's a lot of confusion in this area, which makes it very difficult to respond in a sensible way to what one should be doing. My real point is that if you're talking about farm distress, basically you need a lot more investment in agriculture. You need a lot more investment that will make agriculture climate change proof. I don't believe that's going to happen as a result of income transfers. They're a totally different instrument. And the second problem of farm distress is that even when they get production, prices collapse. For that, you need to modernize markets. Translate that into policies, and I discussed some of those things. You come up with policies that nobody is quite prepared to say that's what they're going to do.
True. I'll move to Navneet this question, which was raised by Dr. Ahluwalia in his keynote address. Are fiscal numbers reliable? Recently, an economist has pointed out that outside borrowings through government-affiliated entities and off-balance sheet liabilities is much higher than the fiscal deficit number. Do you think, what are your comments, and what do you think that breaching a fiscal deficit number, which was like promised in 1920 to be a certain number, 3.1, is great economics?
So before that, if I can take 1 minute on that farm distress. So as India has transformed from a perennial food deficit to a food surplus country, And as he said that we employ better technology, whether in terms of seeds or better equipments or better irrigation and other things, actually the problem is going to be acute because you have much larger number of people dependent on agriculture than what we need today and what we are going to need. Until such time these people can be re-skilled and re-employed into something else, I think we have very little option left but to maybe give hard cash for some time. Of course, I mean, it may be termed as populist or whatever, but given the fact that we are producing a lot more cereals, more sugar, more dairy, more fruits and vegetables than we consume or we need, I think that this problem requires very different mindset compared to what we have been dealing with over the last 30, 40, 50 years. On the fiscal numbers,
but I'll come back to you on a question. I'll come back to you with a question on this particular element. It's a very emotive issue.
On that, whether the fiscal numbers are reliable, interestingly, every single year after the budget, you will have a lot of analysts saying that numbers are not adding up. The math is not adding up because revenue projections are over-optimistic, unlikely to get realized. The expenditure is underestimated. Divestment receipts cannot be that much. We'll have shortfall on telecom receipts or something or the other. The fact is, this year, the fiscal deficit is 0.1% higher than last year, and last year it was 0.3% higher than what was budgeted. Over the last 15 years, there have been only 2 instances where the actual fiscal deficit was more than 0.5%, or actually only 2 instances where it was higher than the budgeted number. The one was in 2009 when it was 3.5% higher than what was budgeted, and the second was in 2012 when it was, if I remember correctly, 1.1% higher than the budgeted. In not a single year other than that, the fiscal deficit actually been higher than the budgeted number. Of course, I'm sure there are ways because you work on cash flow accounting. There are times when subsidy payments get deferred. I mean, the tax machinery works over time. I mean, you get the money from large corporates, defer the refunds, variety of things. PSUs may be asked to give maybe one-time large dividend in the month of Feb, March, but somehow we've been able to manage, and if the numbers have been fudged, then probably today then those liabilities would have been substantially higher. In last 2 or 3 things, interesting aspect is, and you raised that point, that extra budgetary resources have, I mean, that part of the borrowing has gone up quite a bit, so public sector, the Food Corporation of India, because they are not getting the food subsidy amount, or let's say an PFCREC or an NHAI for road construction or IRFC for railway payments, etc., have been borrowing quite a bit of money. And if you add these 2 numbers, then maybe the overall deficit is higher. But as he was mentioning earlier, if the overall investment cycle is going through such a, I mean, the moderated, I mean, the muted investment growth, then the government had to do the heavy lifting, and if these PSUs were not borrowing and investing, then we would have been even a worse situation. I hope that as GST revenues maybe next year, with the 3rd year of implementation starts improving, then government may not have to rely so much on the extra budgetary borrowing when the overall tax revenues move up.
Thank you. I think my next question was basically on GST, and Dr. Ahluwalia, back to you again. The CGST collection for 1920 is estimated as 6.1 lakh crore. The estimate is 6.1 lakh crore. 1819, it is the collections estimated is about 5.04 lakh crore. So if you look at the jump, we are looking at 20% growth over 1819 in 1920. Historically, we are only just seeing about 8% in this data. With the limited history, we have just seen an 8% growth. Now, do you think it is an ambitious target of seeing such high volumes of CGST collections? That's one. And number 2, given it was just a vote on account.
What is the variable that you're looking at?
So the central government's portion of the GST collections, basically.
GST?
Collection, yeah. So the collection for 1920 is estimated about 6 lakh crores. This 6.1 lakh crores. Next year, basically, the whole year. Yeah.
2019-20.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And for 18-19, this number is about 5 lakh crores. So 20% jump. Is this is it possible? One. Number 2, If it is not, given that it was purely a vote on account, are we waiting for some stiffer measures in July? Tax measures around the corner?
Well, I wouldn't speculate on what the next budget will do, because this is just a vote on account. So my feeling is that a serious look at what is likely in 2019-20 will only come when the full regular budget is presented. And even if it's the same government that comes back, they have an option in the light of what has happened to put in the real numbers. Now, is a big increase of this kind possible? One thing you have to recognize is that the GST rates were lowered. So part of the low rate, that low realization, could be because rates were lowered. Now, nobody is saying, one good thing is the budget doesn't decide what the GST rate would be. True. So I have no idea whether whichever government is there, looking at the GST, will decide that, look, this lowering was incorrect and we should jack the rate up. I have no doubt that, the sensible thing to do would be to announce that we're going to a two-rate structure, let's say. If you go to a two-rate structure, you definitely will have to take 5% up. I mean, there's no question about that. Whether any government would want to do that is another matter. But, otherwise it is a big jump, and virtually all the financial analysts that I've seen writing, they say that it's highly optimistic.
True.
But again, I don't take the numbers, don't deserve a great deal of attention right now. The same guys, the officials, the same guys will come up with the numbers. The next budget will be looked at very, very carefully. Because, if you're making an assumption that is unrealistic, then in a way your own credibility would be affected. So we have to wait and see what they come up with in July. On this fiscal deficit, I want to make one point, because I think you seem to be quite charmingly forgiving, what does it matter, 3.4 and so on. See, what are the facts? The facts are that you shouldn't just look at the center's fiscal deficit. I mean, all the economics on fiscal deficit says it's the center plus the states. The states' deficits, we don't know yet. True. But knowing the states and knowing the bonanzas they've been giving, you are going to get an extremely unpleasant shock when those numbers come in. Now, lots of people have said that the combined deficit of the center and the state may end up being something of the order of, and if you put in these off-budget amounts, which you yourself mentioned, you may still be having a combined deficit of 8% of GDP. Now, other developing countries, and we are not, there's no separate economics for India. Other developing countries are running general government fiscal deficit of 2-3%, against which we've got 8. Now remember, when we had the 1991 crisis, the fiscal deficit was 9%. It's now 8.2. So the fact of the matter is we are in a difficult range.
True.
And I think that you have to keep in mind that the global situation, everybody who's looked at the global situation says that things are, A, going to be worse, and B, there's a lot of downside uncertainty. So you're not looking at a global situation where there are many plus factors. In fact, in my remarks, I mentioned the principal plus factor that is there is that India could possibly look better than China if our policies were seen to be clear and not fuzzy, and if the signals that we're giving are clear. That's what, whoever comes in, that's what they should concentrate on. Because the present position, rightly or wrongly, is that China is not attractive for investors to put more money in. They would be looking for alternatives. The question is, are we going to be the alternative that they look to? So there's an opportunity. We may take it or we may miss it. We'll have to see.
Thank you, sir. Rahul, this question to you. The budget actually proposed a 2% interest subvention for MSME sector. I understand, or we understand, that this is basically focused on getting higher GST enrollment, expanding the tax base. But when you look at the MSME entrepreneur, he starts with a very low capital base, fierce competition, and the cost of funding for debt funding for MSME is between 12 and 14%. Do you think that this will help revive the MSME sector, which is struggling? That's one question. As a result of that, a lot of small cap and mid cap companies are also seeing struggling valuations as such on the market. And added to that, I'm also asking that should the government agencies like SIDBI be doing, should have a different mandate in this new regime for encouraging growth of MSMEs?
Let me try and answer that in 2 ways, maybe 3 ways actually. First is that let's take a step back and see that as a country, there is a growing evidence that we seem to have missed the manufacturing wave which a lot of Asian countries benefited from. So obviously we are much more dependent on the MSME sector for employment generation and services, and it shows in our GDP composition. The second is, as we heard, that even the organized sector is employing more and more technology, automation, robotics as a means to and it's much more capital intensive, so the labor requirement there is going to be much lower. So again, it goes back to the fact that SME seems to be the big source of employment generation. So it all, just connecting the dots to the discussion which we've been having on the farm income also. And I think to that extent, all this is part of that like we are providing a cash support to the farmers, this is another way of supporting the next layer of the population, which is dependent on employment generation from the SMEs. So it's all part of the same kind of ecosystem. So whether it's enough or not, you obviously can't support them through cash infusions. We have to support them in terms of providing such infrastructure or financing kind of avenues. So that's how I see it. I think that if you look at the opportunities today in the MSME sector, I think the third leg of my answer is that there is a growing stress in terms of liquidity squeeze which the NBFCs are facing, and the MSMEs have raised a lot of financing from the NBFCs. So there is a risk that whatever squeeze the NBFCs are facing should not result in stress on the MSMEs. And I think there could also be a motivation from that angle to do this. And I think from all angles, whichever angles you want to look at it, any of these 3 angles, I think it makes sense. Whether something can be done more, yes. Outside of the fiscal, yes, I'm sure the government will try and do more and more.
Sure. Thank you. Dr. Ahluwalia, coming back to you, a different question and a different avatar. You worked very closely with the government, really closely with the government, and now for a minute I want to change your role, and you are the new Prime Minister of India. And agrarian stress is right in front of you. Agrarian stress is right in front of you. You are the Prime Minister of India. Farmers are clamoring for remunerative prices. Farm markets are in the way they are. Food processing industries, there's a lot to write about the food processing industry. Accurate demand-supply data eludes the farmer. Warehousing is a challenge. Corporate involvement is a far and long away from where the current situation is. What would you do? How would you change it?
It's very interesting because implicit in your statement is that whoever is the Prime Minister of India is actually also the parliament and automatically has a majority and so on.
Absolutely.
So, quite frankly, the question
we would vote you with that mandate.
The question you should be asking is, if whoever is the Prime Minister of India, if he were to ask me or if she were to ask me, what is it that we should do to address these sort of agri-marketing, agri-processing kind of issues? Then my response to that would be that, I think I mentioned that in my earlier remarks, the 2 sets of things that can be done. One is in the hands of the central government, and one is in the hands of the state government. Then there's a whole lot of things on, ease of doing business, infrastructure, providing power and all that kind of stuff, all of which actually is pretty much in the hands of the state government. So if you were the Prime Minister, there's not much you can do on that front other than write letters to the Chief Minister. But believe me, there's one thing you can do if you have the Parliament with you, and that is, please repeal the Essential Commodities Act. My view is that if any government is not willing to do that, then it's just not serious. Because if you want a modernization of the post-harvest technology in farming, then it will not happen if the Essential Commodities Act, which has completely draconian powers, which can be exercised by deputy commissioners and district commissioners, are still on the books. Nobody in his right mind will invest huge sums of money in a business that can be disrupted at the whim of a local politician. So the fact of the matter, I think it's a useless act. If you do some serious work on it, you will find that the origins of that act is the strange belief that it controls prices. It doesn't. In times when the macroeconomics were conducive to a rise in prices, it utterly failed to control prices. When the macroeconomics is good, the prices are controlled anyway. So this is actually a test of seriousness. If you're not willing to repeal the Essential Commodities Act, please stop talking about modernizing markets. That's my view.
Thank you. Navneet, coming back to you, we're seeing corporate capacity utilization 70%, but one data point which should worry everyone, and that the corporate profit to GDP ratio is at the lowest in the last 15 years. So the corporate profit to GDP ratio is at the lowest in the last 15 years. I want to repeat this for a sense of understanding what is the profit pool or the cash available for a corporate to reinvest in business. Coupled with that, there is continuing challenge with high leverage. GST, people are struggling. NPLs still have not been totally out of the bank system. We've just begun. Do you see a strong pipeline of private sector capex? Do you see that this capex cycle will possibly lead to some more job creation? And finally, what are the structural challenges for doing business in India?
So 2-3 questions there. So first on the private capex, actually we should be thankful that we didn't have a lot of private capex in last few years, because there was no need to invest. We had so much of excess capacity, and corporate balance sheets had to get repaired first. We had excessive leverage in the corporate balance sheet. Banks' balance sheet had to get repaired because they had the high amount of NPAs. If you look at the past cycle of the capex, which we put in power sector, or let's say in steel, or in other parts of the metals and mining, and I can go on, given the overcapacity there was no reason to invest more. And also, if you put in the context of the global situation, where China put up so much of capacity in last 10 or 15 years, and there was a bit of uncertainty, the growth has moderated, and for that, you didn't need so much of excess capacity. If I look at today, and of course, that's the reason government had to do the heavy lifting. And so the investment as a percentage of GDP is probably at a multi-decade low, and within that, the government capex is at a multi-year high as a percentage of the overall within the investment, because government had to do the heavy lifting. I think if I look at today, the need to invest is the capacity utilization and their projection of what the demand cycle would be. So when I look at the capex to depreciation ratio, when I look at the capacity utilization, I think there is a need to invest in several sectors. And when we did the bottom-up work, if I remember correctly, I think cement, steel, tires, other auto ancillaries, chemicals, there are several sectors where there is a need to invest. But you also need capacity to invest. And when I looked at the debt coverage, the interest coverage ratio, the debt to equity ratio, several of the balance sheets have improved, and I think they have the capacity to invest. And you need the banking sector, which is in a better shape today, having taken the pain of the NPA resolution, to lend for the higher capacity. And I think my view is a bit contrarian compared to a lot of other people who believe that investment cycle is unlikely to revive in the near term and budget was consumption oriented. I think the private capex is around the corner. Maybe in the middle of this year, starting from the middle of this year, you are going to see higher private capex come what may, regardless of the election cycle and the other thing. Your other part was on the corporate profit as a percentage of GDP. It's interesting. It's the lowest in history. And actually, if you look at US and some of the other parts, it's the highest in history. So, I mean, there's a tale of two cities, completely different trend. Maybe there are, part of it is structural, part of it is cyclical, why the corporate profit to GDP has fallen. But, I mean, I believe in mean reversion, and I think we are going to have mean reversion. Very interestingly, you know, I mean, I wrote this, you mentioned about the jobs and that whether India's growth is jobless is a hot debate. Whether India's growth is jobless is a hot debate, but it is profitless is a cold reality. I mean, your data consumption is at an all-time high. Telecom companies are transmitting losses. I mean, I can go on. Your airline traffic is the highest in the world, but airlines are filing for bankruptcy. I mean, so there is some bit of disconnect in India, and we need to get this right. I mean, unless you create large profit pools, you cannot have animal spirits and investment and job creation. Maybe if I take 2 more minutes, Rakesh, on the structural challenges, because we talk about the oil prices, politics, several of the other issues in India. For me, for the business community, the 3 biggest structural challenges for India, I mean, he mentioned it a little bit, is the climate change. We have the 4% of water, we have the 4% of land, 18% of humanity, 18% of cattle. 10 out of 10 most polluted cities in the world by a margin are in India. The most water-stressed country in the world is going to be India. We have a serious challenge on climate change, and I think business community needs to understand that. The rising inequality, I think in a liberal democratic system, you cannot have where the highest number of billionaires in the world and the abject poverty of millions of people. Something needs to get done because it will hit business. And the third is, I think,
United Way.
If I take one
Donate
more,
to United Way.
Yeah, and United Way of Chennai is very important from that perspective for businesses to flourish in India.
True.
And the third, I think, which is under talked about or under appreciated is the lack of innovation in India. I think we have very few people like Mr. Lakshmi Narayan and he's sitting here from TCS. You know, 500 top companies in India invested $3.5 billion in R&D last year. 500 top companies in India invested $3.5 billion in R&D last year. One Samsung spent $14 billion. I mean, how on earth we are going to compete against what's happening in Korea today, what's happening in Taiwan, what China is doing. We are losing market share in textiles to Vietnam and Bangladesh. We need to invest a lot more, and I think corporate India needs to understand that. We have a great opportunity, as he said, when the supply chain moves out of China because of whatever is happening globally, but we cannot take it our birthright that it will move to India. It won't. I mean, we have to compete against others, and we have to invest a lot more.
So I'll just take 2 more questions. I'll show you only 2 more questions, okay? Rahul, this question, because a lot of investors sitting here, so I think you must answer this question. Nifty is basically currently, based on the market's question, Nifty is currently trading forward earnings 17 times 1 year forward PE. Trailing is about 22, 23 times. You take a pick on those 2 numbers, out of which consumption and banking continue to trade at a premium, and utilities, metals, and I want to draw your attention, all capex heavy sectors, utilities, metals, infra, cap goods, all trade at a discount, okay? Raising capital when you're trading at a discount to your historical multiples. What is your outlook for the markets, and what would you advise as asset allocation to the people sitting here?
Okay, a lot of questions actually. So let me first answer the market part. You know, just to borrow from the cricket parlance, it feels like we are in the middle overs. So we had a very good opening partnership in 2017. We have had a mini batting collapse in 2018, just barely managing to stay in the game. So this is a year to take the singles, rotate the strike, not try to hit sixes. There will be a time to hit sixes and hopefully not too far away. I think that's the context, and really I think if you look at where the profit growth is going to come from next year, and the estimates for Sensex and Nifty earnings growth rate is as high as 30% in some cases. It's going to come from the sectors which have not done well, which is the reason why the corporate profit to GDP ratio is so low, is because all the sectors you mentioned, commodities, infrastructure, capital goods, and corporate banks have led that decline in corporate profits to GDP. And those, at least two out of those three sectors seem to be coming up the curve. And I agree with Navneet on the capex cycle. I also think that although it could be a little bit early, but I think the wave is there that the capital expenditure cycle on the private side is beginning to see some signs of revival. And it didn't happen just because we had a good government in 2014. It has taken 4 years for this capex cycle to revive. So there is obviously much more economic logic to it and not just euphoria, which is what the case was in 2006, 2008 period. And the other is corporate banks. I think what is happening in the NBFC sector it always happens. It's a cycle that, they grow very fast because of ample liquidity, and then there is a 2-3 year period of adjustment when the banks take back market share. And I think we are just at the beginning of that period when banks are going to take back market share, get back pricing power, and on the other hand, the bad asset cycle has peaked in terms of the provisioning requirements. So you will have a double driver of earnings for them, and that's something which will drive up the growth for earnings as well as the sectors. Indirectly, what I'm trying to tell you is that these are the sectors which would do well in this scenario. I think from a segment point of view, there are 2-3 strategies one can follow for allocation. I think a good value fund in this scenario, coupled with a banking and financial services sectoral fund, is something which makes sense for this year because there are pockets which are looking very stretched in terms of valuation, and the risk reward there doesn't seem to be favorable. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question from me, Dr. Rahul, back to you again. When I was a young boy or a student at my MBA school, I read something called Time Value of Money, which was the first chapter in financial management book, written by I.M. Pandey, I think most of us have read that book, called Time Value of Money. Incidentally, we see the greatest delays of payment from government departments and government when it comes to time value of money. And successive governments, and fail to understand, and successful bureaucrats have failed to understand what is called time value of money. Private sector actually is at the receiving end of a lot of this thing. Your views, because we have seen both governments, so there's none is better than the other. That's one thing. And your favorite topic this evening has been unpredictable regulations. We don't see that in a large part of the world. So what would you leave your advice? You've been in the government. What advice would you leave to the next government coming in? Because you cannot have retrospective amendments which kill businesses when billions of dollars are being put today into India.
No, I think the question you've raised is actually very relevant. And I would hope that whichever government comes in, they pay a lot of attention to this issue. Because, if you want to create a pro-investment environment, then rule number 1, absolutely no retrospective amendments or retrospective changes of policy. By all means, if something has been done, a law has not been drafted correctly, you want to change it prospectively, that's perfectly okay. Even that can create a lot of unhappiness because the ideal country, from an investor's point of view, is where a finance minister gets up and says to the honorable members of parliament that we gave you a perfect tax system last year and I have no changes to make. And now let's look at macroeconomics. That's really good. Unfortunately, anybody who becomes finance minister feels that his contribution to society is judged by the number of changes he makes. This is fundamentally wrong. But this is one question. This is the best thing about GST, because what the GST has done, it has completely ended the terrible feeling that somebody is going to get up there and say, in order to help this group, I'm lowering this rate. It's not going to happen. Now, on the issue of payments and so on and being delayed, this goes very deep in our system because if you look at the rules by which poor old civil servants have to work, under the earlier, Prevention of Corruption Act, it was an act of corruption if you unintendedly gave a benefit to someone without any public interest, even if you hadn't taken any money. That's now been amended. But most of the previous actions are all covered by that Prevention of Corruption Act. Now, it's interesting. If you gave a benefit which was undeserved, you were corrupt. But if you hurt someone in an undeserved manner, you were not corrupt or even incompetent. So it's a completely asymmetric system. If a person delays a payment, as a result of which a business suffers, there's nothing which, as far as he's concerned or she's concerned, they can justify that on the grounds that they're protecting the revenue. The fact that it causes damage, the company may go out of business, fellows may get unemployed, that's just not part of the system. So we need to move to something which makes the bureaucrats or the administrators realize that this is a symmetric act. If you're denying a benefit which is deserved, then there's something wrong that's happening. Now, this is it requires a change of rules, it requires a change of law, it requires a change of attitude, etc., etc., etc. It's not easy to do, but I do think it should be put on the agenda of a government. My feeling is that we have not spent as much time as we should have on tax administration. We spend all our time on tax structure. But lots of people who've looked at the Indian system actually have said that if we could have a government which says that I'm not going to make any change in the tax laws at all, but every year for the next 5 years, I'm going to change tax administration in a way that will improve the incentive for compliance and lead to more revenue, I think we'd be a lot better off. My good friend Partha Shom had submitted, a 3-volume report of tax administration changes. I don't know where, it must be on some dusty shelf of the finance ministry. I think he submitted it in the last year or so of the UPA government. I don't know whether it's been examined, but I'm sure it's 100% valid for the next government. So they should dig it out. But I would be very happy, by the way, if somebody were to say, we have reviewed the Partha Shom report, and now we are implementing 50 of those 200 recommendations this year, and another 50 next year. And I assure you that if you do that, it'll be much better than any tax changes that might be done. But no one pays attention to this. Nor, by the way, is there any pressure from industry. And after all, I don't know if this report has been made public, but industry should, instead of producing a list of recommendations for changes in taxes, which they used to do, why don't they just make a list of recommendations of changes in tax administration? It'd be much more useful in my view.
Good. Thank you, sir. On behalf of United Way of Chennai, let me thank all of you for being here today. The panel will be available later on for questions during the session. And thank you, and look forward to seeing you again next year. I hope the views conveyed here do find some element of hearing and wisdom and active listening in Delhi, and something happens. Thank you.
Rakesh, you must thank this lady standing here for
I must.
3 hours.
I was about to.
Such a complex technical things people have been talking about, and she's doing an unbelievably brilliant job.
Yeah.
Thank you for such an insightful discussion. May I now invite Mr. Lakshmi Narayanan, Board Member, United Way Chennai, to felicitate our panelists and moderators with mementos. They will also be handed over the first copies of the book, Pursuing Financial Reforms Across Countries, Perils, Stresses and Rewards. And in our midst, we have its author, Mr. Subra Ramamurthy. The book consists of his experiences of pursuing financial reforms across various countries of different cultural background, legacy systems and mindsets. Mr. Subra Ramamurthy, FCCA, FCIS, UK, PhD, USA, is an economist with public finance specialization. He has worked with the IMF since 1991 as its fiscal resident, peripatetic advisor in many countries, helping them restructure their economies and fiscal management system, and on IMF diagnostic and technical assistance missions to various countries in Africa, Central Asia, South Pacific and Europe. The IMF also published his working papers on progress made by countries where he helped modernize their fiscal management and budgeting systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, what an enriching evening. This evening would not be complete if I do not thank our speakers and panelists. We are absolutely honored to have had the growth maker, Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and listen to him speak. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Shri Dinesh Kumar Kara, for your candid views and observations of the budget. We all go back home wiser, thanks to Mr. Navneet Munot, Mr.Rahul Singh, and Mr.Rakesh Singh. I also have to thank the sponsors of this evening. Thank you, HDFC Private Banking, HDFC Mutual Funds, for powering today's event. I thank our knowledge partners, IAFL Investment Managers, and Tata Mutual Funds, our silver sponsor. I also thank our associate partners, Aditya Birla Sun Life Insurance, Birla Sun Life Mutual Funds, Reliance Mutual Funds, ICICI Prudential Mutual Funds, India Bulls, Tata AIA Insurance, Value Invest, Waterfield Advisors, Kotak Mutual Funds, Sundaram Mutual Funds, Axis Mutual Funds, Apollo Hospital, and I thank all the guests in attendance here, all our donors, CSR partners, volunteers, board members, and event management partner Wizcraft, enabling partner Vishesh, and thank you Leela Palace for all the hospitality. Finally, thankfulness is the beginning of gratitude. Gratitude is the completion of thankfulness. Thankfulness may consist merely of words, and gratitude is shown in acts. While we thank you all for joining us today, we hope to show our gratitude through our actions in 2019. On behalf of United Way Chennai, I thank each and everyone. And as Archana insists, here are a few lines about me if you are wondering who I am. My name is Justin Jesdas, and 9 years back, a car accident left me paralyzed neck downwards. I reinvented myself by taking myself to sports. I learned swimming after my accident, and today I'm a para-swimming champion at international level, representing India at the Asian Games and at the World Championship. One day, sooner or later, I dream of opening a center of excellence for sports for persons with disabilities and give them a choice as to pursue sport either for competition or recreation or fitness. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for networking and cocktails. Thank you so much.